Great. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Atif, thank you very much for submitting to this.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for doing this.
I'm very excited about the chance to talk with you about your book, House of Debt. For those of you who have not read it, it's available on Amazon with one click. So
everything else in the world.
Exactly. And what I found in thinking about it is it was about a debt crisis in 2008 that seems a history, and that seemed like everything had been written about it. But in fact, I think if you hear Atif's argument and his co-author and think through their solution, not only do you learn something about 2008, but I think it has a lot of application for how we think about other problems going forward. So Atif, just to begin, give us the short, brief summary of the book for those here who haven't had a chance to read it.
Yes, thanks, Tom. So actually, thank you for introducing the book that way, because actually it's in the subtitle as well. But one of the rationale for writing this book was not as much to describe what happened, but really to look forward and say, look, there is one very important lesson that we need to take away from the crisis of 2008, 2009, which applies looking forward. And it applies not just to the US, but also for Europe and for the global economy in general. And I'll try to kind of explain that as we go along. The starting point of the book is really sort of the comparison of 2009 versus 2006. And this is kind of also gives you a sense of how economists like to think. So if you compare 2009, let's say end of 2009 versus the end of 2006, you see that the US economy is hit very hard. Loss of jobs, 8.9 million people lose their jobs. That's like the entire country of Switzerland getting fired, or the entire workforce of Netherlands getting fired. I mean, that's how big this loss was. In terms of output or income, US GDP declined by 10 percentage points relative to what it should have been in 2009. That's like a $1.4 trillion loss. In a different way, it's a loss equivalent to $12,000 per household in the US. And that's a loss they're bearing every year relative to the counterfactual world of no recession taking place. So the natural question, or obvious next question, is why did this happen? Why did it take place? Now, from one perspective, and that is kind of the way economists like to think, from one perspective, it's actually a big puzzle, because nothing really happened between 2006 and 2009. We had this huge loss, but nothing really happened. What do I mean by that? Think of what it takes to produce stuff in an economy: apples, oranges, iPhones, automobiles, so on. There are two main ingredients: human beings, their skills, their human capital, and the physical capital that marries that human capital and produces the goods and services that all of us then use. In terms of those ingredients, nothing changed. People had the same skills, we had the same factories, the same cities, the same infrastructure, and yet we could not produce as much in 2009 as we were producing in 2006. So something kind of strange happened. And what is it really that's responsible for that big decline in output? The core argument in the book is, and we give it away in the title, that it's all about debt. That the cause of this precipitous fall in output and employment is the way we choose, and that's an important word, it's a choice, the way we choose to write financial contracts among ourselves. In particular, between the borrower and the lender, it's the predominant contract is debt, and that choice was actually responsible for the decline in output and employment. Now, once you hear me say it was a choice, the next natural conclusion is what Tom started off with, which is because it is a choice, we can change it. And we can avoid falling into a similar trap the next time. And not just us in the US, but also Europe, also Japan. It's actually a global problem. OK, so I have so far just asserted that debt was responsible for this big decline in output and employment. Both Amir and I, my co-author, we are empiricists at heart. And so anyone makes a statement, we don't believe it. We say, OK, where is the evidence? Where is the proof? So that's one of the distinguishing features of our work, if I can kind of tout my own horn, is that we use data. It's everything, we get micro-level data from the US to paint a picture that proves that debt was actually responsible for this big decline in output and employment. So what's the argument based on on this evidence? The key factor, the key characteristic of debt, which makes it so destructive at times for the macroeconomy, is the inability of a debt contract to share risk between the borrower and the lender. And in particular, when I say share risk, this is really the downside risk that we are talking about. So just take a standard debt contract. Say I want to buy a house, $100,000 is the value of the house. I only have $20,000. I go to Tom, say, give me a loan of $80,000. He gives me a loan. It's a standard 30-year fixed rate mortgage. I buy the house, and now I start living in the house. Now imagine that for some reason, the animal spirit sentiments go up and down. Imagine that for some reason the value of my house falls by $20,000. Okay? What happens in this relationship between Tom and myself in this example? Tom is the creditor, I am the borrower. What happens in this relationship is that the entire loss in the house is $20,000, 20% is borne by me. My equity is wiped out. If I'm a typical homeowner in the US, it basically means the home is also pretty much my entire asset base. So my net worth, I'm basically wiped out. What has happened to Tom in this example? Actually, he has lost nothing, because the value of his mortgage was $80,000 to begin with. The value of my house is still $80,000. So if I don't pay, he can grab my house, sell it, take his $80,000, put the $80,000 in his pocket. And so he actually, in this example, has not lost anything. I have borne the entire loss. Now, there is nothing immoral about this, by the way. Don't get me wrong. We knew what we were getting into. I voluntarily borrowed from. So it's not about ethics. It's about economics. The problem really is, if it were just me, that's the end of it, and who cares? The problem really is that when the shock is systemic, when the shock is at the macro level, it's not just me we are talking about. It's millions of people like me whose net worth has been wiped out, and that loss has not been shared by people like Tom in this example, who are going to be the creditors. Now, you can already see that there is this tension here from a social perspective, because by definition, the borrowers are borrowers because they don't have the money. So they tend to be poorer, less well off in the economy. The lenders are going to be, have the excess savings, and so they're lending to be, so they're going to be richer. So what we are really talking about is that we have chosen, again, to have a financial system that tends to impose losses on the borrower side that actually has the least capacity to bear those losses, to absorb those losses. And that's the fundamental problem. That lack of risk sharing is the fundamental problem. So let me now move a step forward and sort of explain how that lack of risk sharing actually translates into what I started off with, which is the loss of jobs, the loss of output. The key problem with the lack of risk sharing is that because people, the borrowers, which is myself in this example, they tend to be poorer, they also tend to be very sensitive to these shocks to their income and wealth. And so when I have this huge shock to my net wealth, what am I going to? I'm going to get really scared. I've lost my savings. My children's education is potentially in question. What will I try to do? I'll try to start saving again as much as possible. And the flip side of that is I'll stop spending to the extent possible. So and if there are millions of people like me, that's going to be a huge cutback on spending, on aggregate demand in the economy. Now imagine for a second a counterfactual where we somehow had devised a financial system that had shared this risk differently, okay? Which we knew up front. So I'm not talking about bailouts or anything like that. Like up front, people knew that in the event of a downturn, it would have been shared differently. And imagine, for the sake of argument, that instead of imposing the losses on me, we shared the risk so that people like Bill Gates absorbed most of this risk. The point is that if they had to absorb this risk, they already have a lot. So it's not like they're not going to buy that extra car because they have 2 million instead of 3 million in the bank. And the economy, as a result, would suffer less. So that's the first key argument. And if you really look at the logic of this argument, I'm talking about a macro externality here, which is a kind of like secondhand smoke argument, right? That other people are suffering as a result of the actions that Tom and I decide to take, which is borrow and lend to each other, right? And so the spending decline is much worse in the presence of a highly levered economy, which has a lot of debt or borrowing on behalf of households. That's the first step. The next step is that once I cut back on spending, and remember other people like me are also cutting back on spending, the stuff that we used to buy, other people are producing it. They may not have borrowed at all, right? That secondhand smoke effect. They may not have borrowed at all, but because now I'm not buying as much stuff, they get fired as well. And now that they get fired, they also stop spending. So you have this knock-on effect start to reverberate in the economy, and the process and the depression becomes deeper, the recession becomes deeper. There is a second important effect, which is that when my net wealth is wiped out, it's also likely, in many cases, that I'll stop paying my mortgage, which means now the asset is taken away from me and is thrown into foreclosure. Because millions of people are actually going into foreclosure, that actually worsens the fall in house prices. And again, further amplifies the kind of effects that I'm talking about. So this very quickly, in the case of the US and specific to the housing example, is the key problem with debt, which is its lack of risk sharing on the downside.